Hello, I'm Dawn Durham, and welcome to PaTTANpod. Schools and districts that invest in family engagement policies and practices know that that's the key to closing the achievement gap and creating a successful environment for all students. When we think about family engagement, we can think about it as a three-pronged approach: building trusting, collaborative relationships between home and school, respecting, addressing, and identifying individual needs and differences within families, and then building a partnership within the school system and the home system. Joining us to talk about family engagement practices is Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. Thanks for being with us, Nikole.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm happy to be here.
So you work around the state as a PaTTAN consultant, really working with districts and schools to enhance their school engagement policies and practices to create an environment where all students are successful and they can start to kind of look at closing the achievement gap.
Correct.
All right, so let's start with why we have to think about this collaboration. We have over 20 years of research to show that there's a really strong correlation between student success and the impact on family engagement within the school system. Help me out with understanding why there's that collaboration and why we can see such a strong correlation between the two.
Well, first of all, I'm so happy that we're even talking about family engagement. Oftentimes, as educators, we focus so much on instruction, which is so very important, behavior and social emotional learning. But the key undercurrent that's so important in making sure that students are successful is that homeschool connection. And so oftentimes, we don't always think of the family as an active partner. And so that collaboration is so crucial. And the research does support that. It's interesting to note that whenever we have families that are actively engaged, you do see a shift in all of those indicators, whether it's attendance, behavior, or course performance. So when we're looking for the biggest bang for our buck in supporting student achievement, it's at the family level. And it's that connection and consistency between the home and the school.
So you said the word consistency, and I don't think that's one we've thought of before. We talk a lot about the building relationships and the connection, but being consistent in that from not only school year to school year, but classroom to classroom. As we think about middle school and high school students, and some elementary, they do a lot of switching, and so you could have 9, 10, 11 teachers during the course of a school day. You could have school counselors, different principals, different assistant principals. That's really a team effort in being consistent across the board with all the stakeholders in play there.
Absolutely, and you mentioned about middle school and high school and how it definitely shifts. Interestingly, the shift in family engagement and the level of engagement tends to decrease at those levels.
It does, yeah.
So it's the time when you really need that additional family support and we don't necessarily have it. And it's interesting, when I think about family engagement at the secondary level, we often think the parents are the folks that push back. Well, in reality, as you know, when we were teenagers, we didn't really want our mom at school with us in high school. No, it's not cool. So that's how oftentimes family engagement tends to subside at that level, is that this is the time that students are starting to feel their individuality, they want to advocate for themselves, and we see that engagement start to dwindle. But we know that that family component is just so important. So one of the things in my research around family engagement that I found out was that oftentimes we think that home engagement is not as necessary as school engagement. Home engagement is just as crucial. So a parent even knowing how many credits are needed for their student to graduate is a form of home engagement. And it still supports the student achievement because then they're at home advocating with the student on what they should be then advocating for when they go into the school building with their counselor or principal, et cetera. So it's good to know that distinction.
So when we think about kind of what we may have thought or perceived family engagement to be, and I think if we were to just walk out on the sidewalk and say, hey, what do you think family engagement means in a school? I think what I hear you saying is oftentimes the response would be, oh, volunteering in the school, going to open house, attending field trips, when in fact, you know, that is certainly a part of it. But an even larger part is the kind of behind the scenes where I can't get to my child's field trip because I'm here, but I can certainly be at home saying, hey, I know you had a math test on Monday. Did you get your score back yet? Let me look online at how many credits we're looking at when you take your family consumer science. Where are we on our track to graduation? So there's a lot of things that could be happening behind the scenes. That is truly family engagement, not just showing up at the door.
Absolutely. And for so many of our parents, they may not have had such a pleasant experience as a student themselves. So going back as a parent, even seeing the school door can be a deterrent. So for them, it's like, why do I need to go there? I've never had a pleasant experience in school. So that's that trust piece that you have to establish. And for some of us, it means that we have to think outside of the box with family engagement. So for parents like that in our certain types of communities, you may have to meet them where they are. And that may be a church, a community center, a library, where they feel that there's neutral territory and not necessarily a top-down approach where I must listen to you and you're the expert. So I find that that type of engagement strategy can be helpful as well.
So being a part of the community and not necessarily having this barrier between the school building and the families, but engaging in these conversations elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Where, as you're saying, you know, we see our families, and when we know they are comfortable and are more than willing to welcome us into that environment to have these kind of conversations that can be tough conversations, depending on what's going on with the school.
And it brings in a sense of comfort that they can be themselves and be comfortable with discussing those tough conversations around their child. They're the best person that knows their child.
Absolutely.
So we can talk till the cows come home about achievement, but they know how their student will be most successful, and we need to engage them around that.
Excellent. And I want to pivot for a minute here as we're talking about this. You know, family units can look different.
Yes.
And the dynamic is different, the cultures, the norms are all different. How do we, you know, in the school setting, how do we identify, recognize, and respect, and show that we respect all of those diverse family units, because that is a part of breaking down that barrier between school and home? How do we do that?
Absolutely. There's no one magic bullet that solves all of those, because as you said, there's such a variety and variability in family structures now that we have to just be aware. I think that's the key word. In addition to, what I love is that the terminology has shifted, whereas before we always said parent involvement, parent engagement, parent support. And now we realize that students are being raised by a variety of different people. They may be doubled up in a house with an aunt that serves as the guardian, or a grandparent, or single family. So oftentimes we need to continuously say family engagement, because that type of umbrella term can encapsulate all of those varieties of families that we know exist. So that's one thing, is ensuring that we're aware that when parents or families walk into a building, we shouldn't automatically assume that we know what the dynamic or the familial structure is and who is really at the head of that family, because in various cultures that might be the grandmother that kind of tells the parent then how to mother or father that child. So all of those cultural norms that exist, I think that awareness piece is so very crucial. And that respect then, when they do come in the door, that we aren't kind of giving them a side eye or looking at them strange, like that's not the typical framework that we're used to in a family, because now we know families exist in all types of shapes and sizes.
Absolutely. And we want that.
Yes.
Because whatever the family unit is at home, that's where the child is coming to us with that experience and that cultural norm, and, or that just you know, time in a child's life, because family dynamics do change.
They do.
Throughout a period of life for whatever reason.
Right.
So I heard you say we want to be aware of that, and in turn that creates this attitude of respect.
Yes.
Both myself for the family and the family for what we're trying to do here in school.
Absolutely.
And how will that impact the child then? Do we see an impact on when the child feels as if, hey, you know what, they understand what goes on at my house, they understand that that's kind of how we do it? Why is that so important for the child to understand?
Because I think children, for whatever reason, may or may not think that they belong. And so the schoolhouse, in my opinion, should always be a warm, a comfortable place for them. That's the way they're successful. So if there's acknowledgement and respect that my family looks different from Johnny's family, but we're still all treated in a similar fashion, then I know I'm welcome here, and it's comfortable for me to be here. And that if my two moms walk in the door, it's okay, and they'll be well received. So I think that piece is so crucial, and that allows the student to have that sense of belonging, which then impacts engagement, which then impacts overall achievement.
Okay, that sense of belonging and respect all around.
Absolutely.
Here's a stakeholder I think we haven't talked about yet, and that's the community.
Yes.
When we think about family engagement, again, we kind of have to be careful of our terminology, and getting away from saying parent, as it may not be a parent that's perhaps at the kind of the head of the household, but it's not just the family being engaged in the learning, it's the entire community.
Right.
Talk to me about that.
So interestingly enough, when I worked in one of our local schools, they were supporting a new population that had seemed to grow, and that was the Nepali population. And so they noticed that some of the students were coming in and their shoes needed to be replaced. So they had a shoe drive and they wanted to give them the shoes. What they found is when the students had the shoes, they never wore them. And the school, not understanding, kept saying, they're not grateful. We gave them shoes, why don't they use them? What did we do wrong? It wasn't until they reached out to what we call in family engagement terms, a cultural broker. Who happened to be a pastor of a Nepali church who decided to partner with the school. Based upon his input, he helped the school understand that that may have not been seen as a sign of respect. And so in the culture, they didn't accept it readily. So that communication needed to happen, so then the school knew better how to approach that particular culture. That's not to say that all Nepali people feel that way, but in that particular group, that is the response that they had. And so those cultural brokers represent that community. So that's why community engagement is just as important as family engagement, because there are people that can really speak to that community lens and what best supports the people that they see in the community every day.
So be mindful of the perceptions that you're putting out there, perhaps, you know, without any harm, without any intent of doing ill will. But your perception may not match what's actually happening in that subgroup there. And to reach out to these cultural brokers, which is a term I've never heard before, so thank you for introducing that to us. A cultural broker is someone who can kind of assist you and the school and the larger school community in understanding that subgroup. That what's the norm there, what may be seen as respectful versus disrespectful, or how they may view certain things that occur. So that's bringing in that community piece, which, as you had said, is just as important as what we term the family piece, because we are part of a much larger family, and that's extending to our community areas.
Another point too with the community component is this concept of community resource mapping. So for a lot of our families, whether it's rural, suburban, urban, sometimes our families don't know what's at their disposal around the community, and schools can be a conduit for that. So when they engage in community resource mapping, they create a structure that outlines, if you need food, these are the resources. If you need clothing, these are the resources. If you need mental health services, these are the resources. And it creates this structure that then if families come in and they have a need such as shoes needing to be replaced, they can go to those particular community resources readily, and it's easily accessible. So I think that's another component that schools really should think about engaging in, because that's a way of engaging the community. When you partner with them and figure out what their resources are, then you can know how to direct your families appropriately.
Yes, and that's a great resource to be able to develop for a district or a school team to develop is, you know, let's do this mapping of resources, let's involve the community so that we have, you know, we talk about it often, particularly when we think about the time of year we're coming up on in this winter months, when we can see that there may be some needs for students and for some student families. Now I have a readily available resource that I know is vetted through cultural brokers, through community members, that I can say this would be helpful, you know, to engage with the families and offer it appropriately and respectfully, knowing, you know, what the needs are.
You got it.
So when we think back to this, you know, building trust, we talked about that, breaking down barriers, trying to go where the family is comfortable versus just where I am as the educator. We talked about recognizing, respecting, and addressing individual needs. So being aware that dynamics are different. Putting out the message of respect no matter what dynamic you have going on at home, you know, whatever the norm is at home, we acknowledge that and we're proud of that for you. But then also that embracing that partnership, not just with the family unit at home, but the community as well. So that partnership amongst all people, ultimately to see all of the students succeed in that area.
You got
I mean,
it.
that's what the purpose is, right?
That's it.
Breaking down barriers, getting our students to succeed in whatever path they choose to take. But it really does take not just me as the leader in the classroom, but it takes the school community, it takes the home community, and then it takes the larger community.
Absolutely. You're speaking such family engagement language. We talk about systems level approaches, and Brofenbrenner, he's a strong researcher around this. He mentions how those systems support one student. So you have a system for the family, just like you articulated. So it's just cool that now that we've talked it through, it made sense.
Yes, it absolutely does. And again, I'm so, you know, and I've caught myself as a classroom teacher, and even now where I've said, make sure your parent signs this form, right? I've caught myself doing that. I've caught myself saying, well, when moms and dads come and pick you up, and I think, well, it could be aunts, uncles, grandmas, it could be an older sibling.
Yeah.
So there's just showing that awareness and ensuring that any message I put out there, is thoughtful and is intentional and is purposeful and is respectful, based on what I know my students are exposed to and are experiencing at home. So I'm glad that we had this conversation, and now I will be very much more mindful of what I'm saying, and try to catch myself and really reframe what I'm thinking and saying to my students.
And it takes time, and to their families, and it's things I had to learn too. I was a former school psychologist, and oftentimes we just think of that either two-parent home or a single mom. And I've been in IEP meetings where I said 2 dads have shown up, 2 moms, a grandmother, an aunt, and it's just being able to not flinch or be rocked by that. It's like, this is their structure, they're successful, and they just want what's best for their child.
That's right.
So
because
here I am to help.
It comes down to the child.
Bottom line.
That's what it is. It's all about the kiddo.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter anything else.
Exactly.
So now let me ask you this. When we think about growing in our profession and growing educationally, what advice might you offer to those in the field out there listening of how to grow themselves professionally, whether it be in the field of family engagement or any of the areas in which you study?
Well, I think it's important to just be open, to have an open mind. That would be my biggest piece of advice. As I mentioned, and we just talked about it, oftentimes we think about our background, our values, and what has shaped us to be who we are. And I always use the term a proverbial backpack, that we each wear that backpack, and that has our values, our norms, our backgrounds, etc. And our students come in with that proverbial backpack as well. And sometimes those backpacks don't match. So you have to figure out where you do have similarities, but also where you can be open enough to learn from the student as well. So I think an open mind, at least at this point in my career, I'm finding has been the most supportive for students to be successful, is when we can take our biases down and take a look at the student as a whole and say, you may come with all of that, and I come with all of this, but where can we achieve a happy medium so that I can help you be as successful as possible? So if I had one key word of advice for professional growth, it would be an open mind.
I think that's a wonderful piece of advice, so thank you so much. And it's great to end on that note. Thank you for being here with us today. We appreciate you, and we appreciate the work that you do across the state, and we know that you are making an impact and a difference in so many lives of not only the students that you work with, but the schools and the districts that you're also impacting. So thank you so much for your work.
I appreciate that.
Thank you to all of you in the field. You inspire educational growth every day within your students. A special thank you to John Ragsdale for producing this podcast. We'll see you next time on PaTTANpod.